Hi, I'm Don Hubert. I'm the director of the Center for Ethics and Human Values, the organization that's putting on today's event. This is part of really 3 different events that focus on the film, the documentary film Dark Money. This evening at 7:20, we'll be screening Dark Money in 250 Knowlton Hall, the architecture building, and the screening will be followed by a Q&A with the director and producer of Dark Money, who is joining us for the panel today, but I will let our moderator introduce her. Our moderator is Gerald Kosicki, who is an associate professor in communications, specializing in political communications and methods, research methods, and several other things that I've forgotten. He is currently the director of the journalism programs, and he'll introduce our speakers for today's event.
Don, is this on?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Don. Welcome to this event sponsored by the OSU Center for Ethics and Human Values. We're here to discuss Kimberly Reed's new film, Dark Money. Joining us on my right is Kimberly Reed, and John Adams, the main investigator whose work is featured on the film. We're expecting him to be joining us via Skype in a little bit. And on the far right is Darrel Rowland, who's the public affairs editor at the Columbus Dispatch. Darrel has done extensive work over the years reporting on the role of political money and the influence of Ohio and its influence on the Ohio state government and our elections. As Don said, my name is Gerald Kosicki. I'm a faculty member in the School of Communication, and as he also said, I happen to be head of journalism programs. So we set curricular standards for the 175 students in that program. And my committee also has oversight over the Lantern. Now, to say the least, some aspects of journalism are changing very rapidly. And most people know the Lantern as Ohio State's newspaper, and it is that, published on paper 2 days a week. But it's more accurate to say that it's today a 24/7 digital multimedia news enterprise, and it tells the news of the campus and surrounding areas, not just in printed stories, but photo essays, video, other technologies like podcasting and all of this. The Lantern is actually older than my school and almost as old as the university as a whole, but has also launched a large number of careers in journalism broadly defined over the decades. And I'm here to tell you that we aim to do this essential work for many more decades to come, if not centuries. So I'd also like to just make a couple of very brief comments about the role of news in politics and society. I think of a lot more than Lester Holt at 6:30 on NBC, the Columbus Dispatch, Times, Wall Street Journal, MSNBC, Fox, Politico, Axios, all those things. There's lots and lots of places in the world where we can find news in today's world. But I think documentary films are a very critical source of information, and I've pretty much made it in my own life a lifelong habit to watch things like Frontline, Nova, Independent Lens, and Point of View, because they have interesting takes on important trends and ideas that are shaping our world. Documentary film can illuminate many aspects of the issues that the news just can't seem to get to. I can just tell you my own personal understanding of something like domestic terrorism, for example, would be substantially diminished if I had have never seen Marshall Curry's film If a Tree Falls, which came out around 2011 and was nominated for an Academy Award the following year. I feel similarly about Nova's The Spy Factory, a 2009 film about the National Security Agency's surveillance programs after 9/11, or Cheney's Law, a frontline film about the endangerment of civil liberties, the use of torture, dragnet surveillance in the post-9/11 era, as well as executive overreach. Dark Money engages us on the problem of a secret, typically corporate money, flowing into politics in virtually unlimited amounts. It deals specifically with the Supreme Court's landmark Citizens United case in 2010. The film and the problems it highlights, I think, deserve very wide attention. The film helps us focus on the problem, and I'm hoping it sparks widespread discussion and dialogue throughout these United States on the role of money in governance and also what to do about it. So although I realize not everyone has seen the film yet, but I'm confident that some in the room have screened it. In any case, I'm hoping that Kimberly Reed can kind of start us out with maybe a brief overview of the key storylines and some of the highlights of the film to get started.
Sure, and I think we have a trailer ready to go. That might be a good way to start the discussion so you guys get a little glimpse of the kind of basic structure of the film. And there you are.
You know, the number one rule of political or watchdog reporting is follow the money.
John Adams here. I covered the legislature for the Great Falls Tribune.
A source of mine had come across something that I might be interested in.
Voters in your district had never seen something.
No, this was a whole new political attack.
They send out all these mailings. They don't care if they lie.
Nobody knows who they are. They call them dark money groups, and that's exactly what they are.
Corporation funnels money to a dark money group. They send out postcards attacking the opponent. When that candidate gets elected, they support the agenda of the corporation.
I don't know how to fight them. I can't pick up the phone and say, hey, what's your interest in candidate X? Because I don't know who they are.
And it's not just Montana.
Campaign finance is the gateway to every other issue that you might care about.
Americans are barraged by these political advertisements that are funded by who knows whom. We don't even know if they're domestic.
Politics is just child's play to business. They know how to manipulate the system.
You can buy the politicians, you can buy the judges.
When I first got to the FEC, I thought that we would work together on issues such as disclosure.
If A fails 3-3, Oceans fails 3-3, that fails 3-3.
The FEC will not enforce the law.
New allegations in court against a leading legislator.
What's at stake is whether or not Art Whittick broke Montana campaign finance laws.
Do we care enough to demand that politicians comply with our campaign laws?
The bottom line is, did Whittick know that he was receiving all of these services?
I'm going to call it like I see it. This man cheated.
The people who want to keep dark money have a real problem. The public does not agree with them.
They want a government that works for them. It doesn't work for special interests, doesn't work for political parties, it works for them.
This is scary stuff, but I think this is the proving ground now for the American experiment.
That's our snazzy little trailer, all cooked down to like 2 minutes long. That film took 6 years to make, so there was a lot of following a very slow story as it was developing over 6 years. There's kind of a story within a story. So the big story is just about money in politics. Where does that money come from? And what happens when that money is anonymous? When it's anonymous and we can't tell who is trying to influence elected officials to either get them elected or once they're elected to try to change the way that they vote. If we can't tell where that money is coming from, we can't tell if there's a corrupting influence of that money. And so when I heard about the Citizens United decision, which came down in 2010, at first, I thought it was a super important issue. I mean, we're talking about having unlimited anonymous money in our elections. That's essentially what Citizens United, it didn't really create that capacity, but it uncorked it, enabled that ability to have unlimited anonymous money. And there's John. There's John Adams. Can you hear us, John? That's John.
I can now. Sorry about that.
Hey, John. We just watched the trailer. You didn't miss anything.
Okay, good.
You missed the trailer. At first I thought it was a really important issue to follow, but how do you tell a story about anonymous money that people are intentionally trying to hide? I mean, that's what they were trying to do. Is kind of a tough story to tell, and that's exacerbated by the problem that as soon as you show like one bar graph or two pie charts, people basically fall asleep, and it gets really hard to get people to, sit for an hour and a half through this story that you're trying to tell, because you throw a couple numbers around and people get confused, and it's really hard to tell that story. So I didn't quite know what to do with that story for a couple of years until 2012, when I realized that my home state of Montana, where I grew up, was the one state that was really pushing back against Citizens United. People in Montana had, there's not a lot of people who live there. There are a lot of natural resources, and that kind of becomes an equation for a bunch of outside money to come in and to try to develop those natural resources, which usually means that they're going to leave the people who are there who don't have as much power or influence. They're going to leave them there to clean up the mess that is often the result of natural resource development. So that's a very simplified story, but it really is a story that's been happening over and over ever since Montana was founded. And you kind of have a lot of folks who live there who are very resistant to this idea of unlimited money from outside the state coming in to kind of control Montana politics. And especially when that money is secret, when it's anonymous, people get really suspicious. And it made sense to me that my home state was going to file suit and basically take a court case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court to try to overturn Citizens United. And as soon as I saw that dynamic happening, I was like, okay, now we got a film. Now we have people. We can tell a story about people doing real things and show how politics affects their daily lives. So the film essentially follows that 6-year journey for these people who are, trying to figure out where all that money and influence is coming from, versus actually a very small group of lawyers and legislators who were sitting in the State House who were pushing back against it. There were votes and polls and ballot initiatives that passed with about 80% of the people in the state who said they didn't want this sort of spending in their politics. But then you also had a small group, actually the same lawyers who were behind Citizens United, who were trying to attack Montana's campaign finance laws. So we had a drama. We had a story, but I also felt like it was important to tell a story within the story. So this is part 2, right? And the story within that is about journalism. And I didn't start out thinking that we were going to tell this big, broad story about journalism. I started out thinking that it would be a really good idea to have sort of a narrator to tell us about all this money in politics, to investigate all of this, to somebody who could like pick up rocks and see what was crawling around underneath it, or somebody who could flip on the lights, right? And I had been following the investigative reporting for a number of different journalists in the state. There's a pretty strong tradition of following money in politics in Montana. And the person who was doing it really well is this dude up here on the screen, John Adams. And he had like the perfect name of John Adams. So it was a deal. So John kind of became this lens through which we tell the story about money in politics. He kind of becomes the investigator. If y'all have seen All the President's Men, there's a lot of talk about Watergate these days, about kind of figuring out what's going on with corruption in the presidency at the time in the Nixon administration. And at the heart of that story, there were 2 different journalists who were investigating and digging around. It's, if anybody's ever seen an episode of Law and Order, you see how that goes, right? It's like people dig and investigate. And actually what happened in our film too, at the end, is you see we end up in the courtroom with a trial for a really influential legislator who was brought up on these charges of cooperating with one of these dark money groups. So we kind of got this bigger story about following the money in politics, got the smaller story about what happens to journalists, and with John at the center of that story. He was our narrator, but then a bunch of stuff happened to John, and maybe I should let John chime in on that stuff. You can tell us what happened to you along the way.
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. Sorry for being late. I had a little bit of a snafu here in San Diego. My plane landed. I took an Uber to the train station and then promptly left my phone in the Uber, which is kind of a hassle, it turns out. Anyhow, I met Kim in 2013 when she was kind of first really, I think she'd been on the trail for a little while at that point, but I was covering the Montana legislature that session, and as part of that coverage, early on in that session, did everybody see the film?
Not everybody has seen it. Some of them have, but the rest are going to see it tonight. No spoiler alerts.
So there's a scene in the film where I talk about these emails that were turned over to me, and it was because I've been covering these issues and because I've been covering the legislature for many years and kind of digging in and writing the sort of behind-the-scenes stories that a lot of my colleagues in Montana weren't necessarily covering. I had the privilege of getting access to sources that others didn't maybe have, and so I did get a source in the Republican Party who was a sitting legislator who sent me or who met with me and gave me a stack of emails, and those emails really showed they were emails between Republican leaders in the legislature, and what they showed was that there was a really steep division, a really big rift within particularly the Republican Senate caucus between some of the Senate leadership and other members who were kind of powerful members of the legislature. And the way a lot of folks kind of defined it was between the sort of far-right conservative legislators and the more moderate Republican legislators. And what ended up happening was these emails revealed another piece of the puzzle that we had been kind of trying to piece together for several years, which was who's behind these fights between these Republican primary races. This film primarily covers this one group that was spending untold amounts of money in dark money campaigning really aggressively in Republican primary races. And what this email showed was kind of where those divisions fell and what the agenda was, why they were working so hard to primary and to run these primary campaigns and eliminate these so-called moderate Republicans from the legislature. So it was when I wrote that story that I think Kim. It was around that time that I got a phone call from one of Kim and myself, one of our mutual sources, and she said, there's this documentary filmmaker and she'd like to meet with you, and I did, and so Kim and I kind of started talking more as sort of two professionals who are in the sort of the journalism field following the same story but in different ways. Kim, this long form, big, broad look at this issue. Me, sort of that, I was in the trees, whereas Kim was more looking at the forest, if that metaphor makes sense. And so we started kind of talking and collaborating, and then over time, she convinced me finally to sit down and kind of talk about some of these issues on camera as a journalist covering these issues. And what I didn't realize was that my own job was soon going to be in jeopardy. And so in the 2015 session, after Kim and I had been talking for a couple of years, I was faced with a corporate downsizing at the newspaper where I worked at, the Great Falls Tribune. And given the choice between applying for a new position or taking a company buyout, I opted to take the modest, very modest buyout that they offered, because I just saw where things were going with corporate journalism, and I didn't like what I saw, and I didn't necessarily trust that the kind of journalism that I like to do and that I excel at would have a home at that paper any longer. And so it was through that process that I kind of came up with this. It wasn't my own idea. It wasn't a new idea. There had already been nonprofit news organizations out there in the country, but there really wasn't one in Montana. And certainly there wasn't anybody doing the kind of work that I wanted to do. So I started the Montana Free Press as a nonprofit news organization so we could continue to cover these kinds of issues with the freedom and flexibility that I think is necessary for that kind of reporting. So that's kind of how I got started with the Montana Free Press. And of course, that made for an interesting narrative twist for Kim, the storyteller, when one of her subjects suddenly found himself without a job and making it. I made the choice to move out of my house and to sell off all of my belongings that I didn't really need, and kind of lower my overhead and my cost of living to its sort of bare necessities. And I was sort of living in my truck and living on people's couches and in friends' cabins and whatever it took to basically give myself the room I needed to try to start this new nonprofit journalism outfit without any money and without any experience. So that's how it all started. And then Kim called me up last fall and said, "Hey, dude, we got into Sundance," and then that kind of changed things. So now the Free Press is off and running. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell.
So we kind of have these two stories, right? Story within the story. The larger story is about money and politics, and Montana is kind of this microcosm for what's going on in other states around the country. And then the story within the story, John is sort of this microcosm of what's going on with journalism around the country. So it's important to tell big stories, I think, but the only way to get at those big stories is through these individual, small, very personal stories, and hopefully you can generalize out from there enough that you can start extrapolating and applying the lessons that you learn in these smaller stories to what's going on in the rest of the world, rest of the big world.
So, John, were there special reporting challenges? I mean, besides living in your car, I'm actually kind of curious about how that affects the job of reporters. But what were the special reporting challenges of this particular story that you were covering?
Well, this first started for me in 2007, shortly after I started my job as the Great Falls Tribune Capitol Bureau Chief. John Ward, one of the Republicans in the film, he came to my office one day and he had a stack of these mailers, and he said, these guys took me out and they did it in a really kind of unprecedented fashion. And at the time, I was a little bit ignorant about what was going on, and I looked at the flyers, and yeah, they were kind of nasty, but I thought, isn't that what politics is these days? Just mudslinging and people. What I didn't understand was what he was trying to explain to me, and I didn't understand it. And part of that was my lack of experience and just kind of being new on the beat. I didn't really understand why this was so different in the sense that these 501c4 groups had cropped up, and that was kind of new. I mean, 501c4s have been around for a long time, but the use of 501c4s for this kind of campaigning was pretty new at the time, and so it just kind of caught us by surprise. And so in subsequent elections, we saw the rise of this group at the time called Western Tradition Partnership, and we were just trying to figure out, well, who is Western Tradition Partnership? Where do they get their money from? And it wasn't obvious because they didn't have to report it, but it was obvious that they had a lot of it because they were spending a lot of money on these postcards and flyers. And so one of the challenges for me was just trying to understand the process I didn't know anything about the political mailing world, that there are entire firms out there whose job it is. They're called print shops. They're usually referred to as print shops or printing operations. Very sophisticated operations that, and those mailers aren't cheap. They're not cheap to produce. They're not cheap to mail. The lists that you get for knowing who to send them to, those lists don't come cheap. And so there were all kinds of aspects to this thing that I had to learn about kind of as I was going. And it was a process of several years and bits and pieces of information leaking out over time and putting other reporters, things that they had reported, putting that in context of things that I was reporting and kind of just piecing all of those pieces together. But it was a really long period of time. The film kind of abbreviates it into a nice, clean, I think we're at 83 minutes now. But this was a process of discovery that went on for probably close to 10 years by the time it all came to a head. Specific challenges, lack of transparency. That's the biggest one. In this case, what we had were a couple of big disclosures by accident, leaks or accidental leaks, that without those, we may never have figured it out. And so these Colorado documents, which those of you who've seen the film, you know what I'm talking about. Those of you who haven't, it turned out that several boxes of documents were located in a house in Colorado that were turned over to Democratic Party officials in that state who recognized that there was a whole bunch of information in there about campaigns in Montana. And so they shipped those boxes up to Montana, where our state regulator, the Commissioner of Political Practices, looked at them and said, hey, wait a minute, this looks like evidence of coordination between these groups and these candidates. So that leak of those documents, and then the commissioner making those documents available for inspection to the press, and then a subsequent legal action against those candidates. During the process of investigating that case, people who used to work for that company, Western Tradition Partnership, voluntarily turned over tens of thousands of pages of emails to the commissioner's office. And I put in a Freedom of Information request to the commissioner, my argument being that once the commissioner had possession of these documents, they were no longer private. They became public documents under Montana's right to know laws. And the commissioner complied with that request and made those available. So then the real challenge began, going through all of those tens of thousands of pages of emails and finding which pieces were relevant and how they connected to other pieces of information we already had. And then that was where there's the scene in the movie where I'm on the whiteboard and, mapping it all out on a big whiteboard to see exactly how that flow of money from how that the National Right to Work Committee into Western Tradition Partnership to the candidates, how that all played out and why it was done. I don't know if I answered your question there.
No, that's really helpful. Darrel, Montana's population is like about 25% smaller than Franklin County's, but the fallout from some of these issues that are discussed in the film surely must have relevance for Ohio as well, right?
Well, absolutely. That's, again, the Citizens United decision and there's subsequent decisions as well for any pre-law folks. Speech Now versus FEC, an ensuing decision that led to super PACs and all these other things. Part of this is you have this whole specialized vernacular, and one of our bad habits is we kind of throw all this around, dark money and C4s and all that stuff. Again, the way it's supposed to work, and these were reforms enacted after Watergate, back when your parents were young, you're supposed to disclose the money you get because it was recognized nationally and intuitively, I think, by most voters that money can corrupt, especially if you're like Dick Nixon, you're getting suitcases full of money. That's not just an illustration. That literally happened from a major corporation at the time in the early 70s. So, okay, we got to do some disclosure laws. So ever since, the idea has been, get that disinfectant out called sunshine, let it in, and there's various limits and whatever on how much you can give, but the bottom underlying principle is show us where it's coming from. And that's why Citizens United was a game changer. There's always been abuses of the system. People hire very smart lawyers to find loopholes, but this was like not a loophole, it was like a loop canyon, if you will, Citizens United, in that you no longer had to disclose under certain very broad conditions. Again, dark money simply means we're turning the premise of openness upside down. We don't have to tell you where our money's coming from, who gave it to us, and we can give it anonymously. This will show up, and many of these groups have esoteric names, as John found out in Montana. Some you may have heard of, some you may haven't. In Ohio, Americans for Prosperity. You've perhaps heard of the Koch brothers. They're industrialists from I think Oklahoma, fund this. They are concentrating on 6 House races, including 2 not far from here, one up in the Westerville area, one up just across the line into Delaware County. So they will be funding mailers. If you live there or you have friends or family that live there, tell them to save their mailings on this. Look at the disclosures. The law says they have to have paid for by. Now, you might see paid for by Ohioans for Good Government, which tells you nothing, but that's a big tell that is dark money, because otherwise, if it's the Republican Party or the candidate committee himself, that's how it's supposed to work. And again, 501c, that's the whole charitable foundation section. You've probably all heard of 501c3 groups. Those are, just nonprofits. C4 groups are, in theory, education groups. These folks that John exposed, in theory, that was an education group. And you're supposed to and they've filed with the federal government, say, we're an education group. We do good things. We shouldn't have to pay taxes, and the IRS has agreed. And instead, they pay, half of their money to politicians and disguise it. 501c5, 501c6. The group, tax-exempt groups for labor organizations and for business organizations. Everyone from the AFL-CIO to the Chamber of Commerce. All of those folks are very active in Ohio. At most, you can see that the Chamber of Commerce has given money, or their political action committee has, or one of the union PACs, but you don't know where that money came from specifically. At least you know, okay, that's union money, that's that's chamber money. You pretty much know which side they're on. We started writing about this in 2010, shortly after the passage of Citizens United, because I think everyone realized at the time this is indeed a game changer. And groups, again, more conventional groups like the Republican Governors Association, the Democratic Governors Association, are funneling money under this clause because they're organized. They're actually a 501c group. So, hey, we can take money in unlimited amounts from corporations, what have you. And since they're not disclosing, it's not legal, but since they're not disclosing, it could be from Russia, because we don't know. No one checks that out. All right? So that happens in Ohio. Some of those campaign ads you see, and you'll see them on TV. If you watch TV at all, or if you're online, you'll see Facebook ads. You'll see them on your Twitter feed. They're pretty ubiquitous nowadays. In 2010, we found that the Republican Governors Association was divvying up money to Ohioans. And I'd actually forgotten about this. I dug out my old story from 2010, and the way they did it, they collected money, threw it all into a pot, and they gave it out to each state according to what the maximum amount was for Ohio. So they're magically, all these checks for Ohio, $11,395, which was the maximum contribution for campaign, for individuals' campaign contribution. And there were an interesting list of names of donors. Stanley Fulton, who's Anchor Gaming in Las Vegas. Peter Coors of Coors Brewing. Some of you have helped make his profit, probably. Sheldon Adelson, again, another casino mogul. And the reason I'd forgotten about this, and it struck me now, there's some guy named Donald Trump, at least according to what they provide Ohio, gave money to John Kasich. He would go crazy now if he knew that. But it's all fake. It's just all an accounting maneuver. It's like, okay, here's the limits. We'll just say that this came from Donald Trump, this came from Sheldon Adelson, whatever. It's all a fake. I won't take up any more time. We went to the spokesperson for the RGA, the Governors Association, and they basically said that they're above state law. because, quote, corruption is impossible, and therefore campaign finance limits are unconstitutional if advocacy is conducted by a group independent of a candidate and political party. Corruption is impossible. In other words, anything goes. This little bit of information we're telling you, even though it's misleading, we're good guys, because that's above and beyond what the law requires, because we can do anything we want to. And, you know, we're kind of reaping that whirlwind now, I would say.
Yeah, one of the things that I was really interested in the film was the focus, in addition to Montana, but also Wisconsin. I used to live in Wisconsin when I was in graduate school there, and you know, so I mean, I'm familiar with Wisconsin. I lived in Ohio for a lot of years, and you know, but when Scott Walker was elected there, a lot of things changed from the progressive little utopia that I remember. You know, the People's Republic of Wisconsin changed dramatically, and then the same is at the same time John Kasich was elected in Ohio, and the two states actually had rather sweeping agendas that seemed largely in line with the recommendations of you know, a group called ALEC and other sort of funded groups on the national scene. I don't think that that's exactly a coincidence, you know, a big plan to, you know, get rid of unions and things like this, you know, it's a whole bunch of things. Like, you know, Wisconsin, and then a week later, Ohio would do the same thing, you know, and so how is it that you decided to deal with Wisconsin at all? And I'm just wondering if Darrel has any kind of observations about that as well.
Yeah, you know, Wisconsin is a cautionary tale. Wisconsin is an example of what happens when dark money not only starts taking over elections for usually the state house or for state senators, governor's race, when it not only gets the executive branch and the legislative branch, it's an example of what happens when you take over the judiciary as well. Because when that happens, when all three branches of government are involved, nobody's looking out for corruption in the other branch. We're seeing a little bit of that going on maybe at the federal level these days. It's a different story about how we're getting there. We can talk a lot about that. But what happened in Wisconsin is the very same dark money groups that were giving to legislators were also giving money in Scott Walker's governor's race. So there you got your legislative branch and your executive branch. And then, once people started to get hip to that and want to investigate it and bring lawsuits and figure out where all this money is coming from in the judicial branch by taking things to court, it was discovered that these groups, this one dark money group, Wisconsin Club for Growth, was also giving money in the elections for people who were sitting on the state Supreme Court. So you've got people in the state house, in the governor's office, and on the state Supreme Court who are being supported by the same group. And what the state Supreme Court did was shut down any investigations into where this money is coming from. And not only did they shut it down, they sealed the record so that nobody would ever see it. So it's a very stark example of people operating in their own self-interest, people not wanting to get busted and kind of covering the tracks for others. And it was actually just a really stark example of a cautionary tale of what happens when a little bit of dark money from a handful of people takes over, and when it takes over branch after branch of government. When we've been taking the film around the country, and we ran into a really good, I think really practical story of how dark money groups work that you guys can keep in mind. We were in Nashville, and there was a ballot initiative. Sometimes people call them voter referendums. And Nashville is trying to figure out if they could have public transportation. And there was a bunch of Koch brother money that came in because they often oppose public transportation initiatives because they would argue that they don't want to raise taxes that much, it's not worth it. Now you can ask, why are people from Kansas or Las Vegas or Manhattan are like, why do they care about public transportation in Nashville? And you should ask that question and be skeptical about that. But nobody was really surprised that the Koch brothers were spending a bunch of money in this ballot initiative in Nashville, because they always do that stuff. But there was another big chunk of dark money that people just could not figure out where it was coming from until the very last second, where they realized that the guy giving all the money to oppose public transportation was the guy in town who owns all of the car dealerships. So for me, that's a really good example of what I think is fundamentally unfair about dark money, and what's fundamentally undemocratic with a small d about dark money is that, you know, if we want to all get together and figure out how high taxes should be to create a system of public transportation, and how much we should spend on that, how far should it extend, how many buses, how many light rails, whatever. Let's have that public debate. Let's do that, and let's discuss that in public. But when one guy can spend a bunch of money in secret to try to defeat something that is to his own financial benefit, it becomes a very different story.
Interesting. Americans for Prosperity, again, this is the Koch brothers group, 2 or 3 years ago opposed a levy for the Columbus Zoo. So that's the level of involvement. You know, talk about right down to where you live, local issues. It's not just all this White House or State House stuff. It's, you know, stuff like that. And
in 2014, they spent money in a school board race in Corpus Christi, Texas, and 3 of the school board seats. And yeah, so I can speak.
Jerry mentioned ALEC. It stands for the American Legislative Exchange Council, kind of a hazy group. Generally a conservative agenda, that's fine. You look at a state like Ohio that's been a predominantly Republican legislature for good 20 years now. ALEC's agenda and the Republicans overlap a lot. Well, how much do they overlap? You look at Ohio laws or proposed legislation, you look at model legislation from ALEC, and they seem to be real similar. Now, you can't tell for sure, however, because, again, this is in the whole theme of transparency. You cut off looking at campaign finances. In Ohio, there's this thing called the Legislative Service Commission, and those are the pros, the lawyers, the professionals, the staffers who've been there for years. We talk about legislators writing laws. Well, of course, they don't actually literally write the laws. It's the LSC, because they're specifically equipped for that. About 15 years ago, those used to be public records. They were closed off. I did a story like on the last day they had open records, and you could go in there and look through the files of here's, you know, Senate Bill 143. It had something to do with guns. You could track all the communications on it, and here's the bill, here's a letter from the National Rifle Association. Oh, by the way, here's a sample bill. Look at the sample bill, look at the real bill. Yeah, copy and paste. And it went the other way too. There was like some national education legislation, same deal. Here's what we propose. Transform straight from the lobbyist's hard drive into legislation. And a lot of it passes here in Ohio. We can't track that anymore because those are not considered your records and my records. Those are their records.
Yeah, there's at least one state where some legislator submitted a bill, and it actually had, we know it's from ALEC because it actually said in there, insert your state name here.
And they forgot.
He didn't even bother to like edit it, you know, and put in his own, I mean, but that
thank God for stupid legislators,
yeah, but,
you know.
But it's
right,
just so blatant, right? I mean, it's just really quite shocking.
Jerry, I do have to say one more thing, and I hope you do get to watch the film. I looked at it streaming online last night, and you know, it was a good documentary until John got to the part about, as he just mentioned here, about the buyouts. We just lost 7 people from the Columbus Dispatch last week from corporate buyouts, and those weren't the first round. And so people had some hard choices to make. And our State House coverage is allegedly our franchise. I supervise our State House and political coverage here in Columbus, the state capital. I call it, you know, it's sort of the company town, Ohio State government. That's the 2 big things. I have not been able to add or replace, not just add, I haven't been able to replace a reporter for reporter since 2010. And we can go on about wages frozen and all that. I haven't had to live out of my vehicle, but my gosh, John, I came to that part and it was almost like a tear came to my eye. You're doing God's work. I just have so much respect for the dedication, dude.
Well, I appreciate that. And, you know, the thing that has been really interesting for me with this film is, you know, I didn't think that I was doing anything heroic or God's work or anything like that. I was just trying to figure out how to keep doing my job the way I wanted to do it. And I thought I was being kind of selfish about it. And, you know, a lot of people, I think, thought I was nuts, and it strained relationships, and it strained, you know, financially. And there was a period of time where I thought that I had basically made a huge mistake. And so for this film to kind of come out now and for people to see it, and for those decisions that I made to be seen not as a mistake, but something, you know, that was, you know, bold or you know, I think the word heroic is a little over the top personally. I think there are people out there like me who are really passionate about journalism and want to do the good work. We're in an industry right now that's facing a crisis, and there are a lot of people out there trying to figure out what the next move is. How do we keep journalism alive? How do we keep in-depth reporting alive? How do you reach audiences whose attention spans are bombarded by information on a constant, you know, at a constant clip? And so that's why I went with the nonprofit model. That is, I believe that's going to be the future of journalism, is community buy-in in the concept of the fourth estate, in this idea that journalism serves a critical role in our democracy, and that it deserves to be supported, and maybe not as a commercial enterprise, but maybe as a public service, much in the way that public radio receives support. You're seeing experiments with public financing of journalism in states now. I think there's an example of that in New Jersey. There's, you know, I know there are other. I talked to a local lawmaker in California. I'm trying to think of where I was. I've been all over the country. But she's a county commissioner, and she's trying to figure out if they can get county money to support a local, you know, that's in Silicon Valley, you know, where there's a lot of money and a lot of tax revenue there. Can they put some of that tax revenue into a publicly funded journalism outfit? People realize now, maybe more than they have in the last 20 years, how important this kind of reporting is. And I think there's now a renewed interest, whereas the public had gotten accustomed to just reading news stories for free on their phones and on their you know, Reddit, wherever else. I think now people are starting to realize that as it diminishes to just a fragment of what it once was, they're seeing the impact of that, and they don't like what they're seeing. And I think the public is now coming around to this idea. So anyway, that's kind of a long-winded way of saying that I'm still optimistic that there is a future for this kind of journalism. And the support that I've seen just from this film and Kim's ability to raise awareness of this issue on a really grand scale, it's been really heartening to me to see the reaction from around the country to this. And I just hope that, you know, people who see this film and like what they see with the Montana Free Press will look for ways to support that kind of journalism in their own communities, because I do think it's the future. I think nonprofit collaborative journalism, where reporters are working together to tell more of the good stories rather than trying to constantly beat each other on the same story. You know, our motto is we don't need to get it first, we want to get it right. And you know, our stories tend to be longer, they tend to be more in depth, they tend to be laden with documents and that sort of thing. And I think that's okay. We're not necessarily going to have the volume of readers that that BuzzFeed or, you know, some of these other websites that really kind of build their model off of, you know, clickbait. We're not going to have that kind of readership, but our stories are going to have an impact because we're going to get on the record really important stuff. So that's kind of our goal with the Montana Free Press. We don't publish every day. We don't try to beat our competitors with scoops. We try to report the things that aren't being reported anywhere else, but need to be told. So I'm just very fortunate that Kim, recognized that as a subplot for her narrative and included our story in that, because I do think it's important, and it's really great that message is getting out to a really broad audience now.
Yeah. Well,
I just really quick. There's one other kind of side benefit from having local journalism. I did a Q&A with Chuck Todd, the guy from Meet the Press, and he was talking about, he had been talking to Tom Brokaw, long-time television journalist, about the erosion of local journalists, and both of them agreed that we wouldn't have a situation right now where we have at the national level where people in the press can be called the enemy of the people or attacked daily, or, especially at political rallies. We would not have that environment if people knew a journalist. If you stood in line at the grocery store next to somebody in your hometown and could see that person as a human being who buys groceries along with you, if you can take members of the press and reporters and journalists and put them off into this other category that dehumanizes them, it doesn't take too long before we end up with them, feeling threatened at political rallies.
So, it may be that the audiences have short attention span, but I really commend everyone here. You've had, shown great forbearance in, sort of listening to us talk. And so we'd really like to take some questions, from you if you have any. So, somebody want to start off?
And will somebody repeat them into the mic so that I can hear them too? Okay.
I was looking into SEC donations by some of the members of the board at Ohio State, the Board of Trustees, and one had given, him and his wife both gave $2,700 to Kasich 2 years before Kasich nominated him to the board. I was wondering if that's a common occurrence, my first question. And the second question would be...
Yes.
Okay, and the second question is, if I want to look more, do you suggest looking at the SEC website or a different website that would be... Or is there a different website that I should be looking at, where I can find, donations and stuff like that?
It would be Ohio Secretary of State's office for state-level candidates. You're going to the FEC, that would be federal, so it must be the Kasich's presidential campaign? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so federal FEC website, or there are several good sites. You saw, I don't know if she's identified in the trailer, but Sheila Krumholtz runs the Center for Responsive Politics in Washington, D.C., a legendary, sort of like the first that I knew of, a national campaign finance watchdog. The film shows a guy I talked to way back in the 90s, Ed Bender, does money in state politics out in Montana, out in Kim's home state. And he's another guy who's doing God's work, and more power to him.
Those two sites are the federal stuff, opensecrets.org, opensecrets.org, and then the state and local donations. The one that happens to be based in Montana, that's followthemoney.org.
And what was the Ohio State Secretary?
Just Ohio Secretary of State. And just Google that and go to the campaign finance section. And there are 3 separate search. You can do a simple search, advanced search, or if you're really masochistic, you can FTP the entire database of all the downloads. And the smoke will be coming from that Mac if you do that.
You journalism students might be interested to know that, our film, in conjunction with John, in conjunction with the Institute for Nonprofit News, INN.org, we're developing a tool that will basically tap into the followthemoney.org data, and that tool will be kind of built into a WordPress theme, so that if you are a nonprofit journalist that is in this umbrella organization of the Institute for Nonprofit News, and when you join, one of the things they do is give you kind of support your endeavors in journalism, and they give you WordPress themes so you can publish online, and that WordPress theme will have this data tool built right into it. So we're trying to again, the answer to all of this is sunlight, is disclosure, sunlight, being able to follow where that money is coming from, and hopefully that'll make it easier.
And again, that's the open money. Dark money, and again, John may have some more tips on this, that's really hard to find without a source. Sometimes there are hints on SEC filings, if it's like big corporations, there are certain disclosures they have to make. There's IRS Form 990s, which is like an individual's 1040, except the 990s for a nonprofit. Sometimes there are hints there, but that's tough, and that's that's a lot of legwork.
So I was going to make two quick points, or try to make them quick. First of all, to redouble your point, the fact that you know that those donations were made and that appointment followed, that's the beauty of disclosure, right? Then the public can look at that and then they can evaluate for themselves whether or not they think that's okay. I just wrote a story, if you go to my website, montanafreepress.org, about 2 or 3 stories ago, I wrote a story about our U.S. Senate candidate who was then running for Commissioner of Securities and Insurance, the state auditor. He took $20,000 in campaign contributions from an organization that was facing sanctions from that agency. I reported on that a couple of weeks ago. It was a big news story. A lot of people said, well, so what? It's not illegal. No, it's not illegal, but it's still a news story. The public still has a right to know how these politicians are, giving back to their contributors. But you only know that if you know who contributed. And so that's why dark money is such a problem. And another tip on tracing dark money, yes, you can see dark money expenditures. While you don't know who funds the dark money, what you can do is you can connect the dots with these organizations. A lot of these groups on their 990s, what you'll see is that they're all registered to the same post office box. So if you see a bunch of expenditures by 501c4 groups in a local election or your state elections, and you go back and you look at their filings and you find out, well, who are they registered with? You can track down that treasurer, you can track down, a lot of times they're traced back to law firms in Washington, D.C., but then you can kind of connect, well, who are the principals at those law firms? And then you can start to piece together who are the individuals. It's all a matrix. It's connecting the dots and figuring and then seeing where the patterns roll out. But it's a lot of work, and you got to dig.
So maybe another question.
I think the journalistic profession gets an A+ on covering the dark money story. I think the journalistic profession gets an E or an F on covering the story of dark elections. And by that I mean the manipulation with computer algorithms of the vote counts to change the election result from a Democratic candidate to a Republican candidate. And the evidence of this is conspicuous. And again, it's the journalistic profession are the ones that fund the exit polls. And the exit polls are the international gold standard for detecting election fraud. And they consistently show this red shift in our elections, and it gets adjusted by the pollsters to conform to the reported result, because we don't have fraud in the United States. And the newspapers, TV, and so on will not cover the story. And that's what I really puzzles me.
Cliff, it's just hard to, I just haven't seen the direct evidence. I mean, I'm always willing to look, as you well know. Cliff and I worked together on many stories over the years, so, to me, the shift, the difference between the actual results and exit polls is not dispositive, I guess. And you talk to the people at the Edison Group who do the polling, and they've acknowledged that there is perhaps some self-selection in those exit polls that cause them problems. So, I don't know, but show me somebody who's shifting the algorithms, and I'll go for it.
Yeah, that's a really big question you've asked, and I think I agree with Darrel on that. Exit polls have a few problems, and I don't think they're quite as all that as you suggested, but but there is, it's certainly an arguable question, I think. How are we doing on time,
We are out of time. I'm sorry for that. I wish we the conversation could go on. I think it's possible that our panelists will be able to stay here for a few minutes and answer informal questions. If you want to come up and ask some questions, maybe John will be able to stay here for a second as well and answer some questions. Please join me in thanking all of our panelists.